Hello everyone, and welcome to the first webinar of Cyber Warfare and Terrorism, a short course presented by IT Masters on behalf of Charles Sturt University. My name is Guy Coward, and I'll be your MC today and for each webinar in this series. And your mentor for the course is Richard Stiennon, who you'll hear from shortly. Before we begin, just some housekeeping. All webinars for this course will be held at 12 midday Australian Eastern Daylight Time, with recordings made for those of you who cannot attend the webinar on a given day. Despite this, if you can make it, we hope you'll attend the live webinars and contribute to a collaborative learning environment, which we really hope to foster. On that contribution, for those of you who have not used Zoom webinars before, just a few words on its functions. We encourage the asking of questions and the use of chat during the webinar, and there are two ways to do so that we use. We ask that you direct all course content related questions to the Q&A section for Richard to answer, and that you send all administration type questions to the support team in chat. You can chat with panelists only or to all attendees. And you can do that by toggling through the Dropbox once you've opened the chat log. In most cases, the buttons for these options run across the bottom of the window. Feel free to have a play in Zoom if you're listening in Zoom, as you really can't break anything. Given the enormous cohort, we've got nearly 400 students at the moment, we likely won't get to all questions, but if something is particularly important to you, feel free to just ask it again, or even ask your fellow students in chat. We found from previous courses that there's usually some very experienced industry-based experts who will be quite useful in chat, and they're often able to answer your questions. For those who've never taken part in the short course with IT Masters, we are a training organisation that exists as a partner to Charles Sturt University, who we work with to create and deliver a number of their master's courses. We also market these courses on their behalf and think and hope that the best way to do that is give some of it away free. If we do a good enough job, then students will be encouraged to enrol in the full masters if it suits them. But with that said, we hope that these courses stand alone in their own right and are their own reward. We want you to learn some useful information, have some fun hopefully, and make connections with your fellow students. We have a big team from IT Masters on hand today in administrative and technical support roles, so thank you to James, Diane and Chelsea. They are also responsible for the learn.itmasters.edu.au website, which is where you'll find the other materials needed for this course: readings, links, discussion forums, and quizzes. If you have any questions today or later on, please feel free to contact us using the details on that page. Later, Jason Howarth of CSU will be along to talk about a research participation opportunity, and you can also get more information about that on the learn.itmasters.edu.au course page. I'll put some links up for that in a second. So if you have any questions about that, he will answer those later. I'll hand you over now to Richard. Richard Stiennon literally wrote the book on cyber warfare. There Will Be Cyberware. There Will Be Cyber War was a Washington Post bestseller. He has presented on cybersecurity in 29 countries, on 6 continents, and has a master's in war in the modern world. I'm very excited for this course, and I hope you are too. So let's get into it. Can you please welcome Richard Stiennon?
Thank you so much, Guy, and welcome everybody. I'm going to dive in pretty quickly because there's a lot of material to cover in 4 short webinars spread over 4 weeks. A little more background on me. I started writing about cyber warfare in 2008 after the infamous attacks on the country of Georgia. Which at the time met my definition of cyber warfare. Published a book called Surviving Cyber War in 2010, along with a lot of other authors who had published about the same time. We all had the same material to work with, had slightly different approaches to it. I take a industry specific, so industry and technology approach, but as I was writing it, I realized I probably didn't have the academic backpinnings to my interest in the history of warfare. So I went back to school and got my master's in War in the Modern World from King's College, which of course generated a master's dissertation at the end of 3 years, which turned into my last book, which is There Will Be Cyber War, which is really about military operations and the future that I expect. And we're going to get into that in the last module in this course. In this course, we've got 4 separate modules, and I'm going to start by introducing cyber weapons, because warfare and weapons are intimately coupled. And then next week, we're going to talk about how the Orange Revolution sparked the rise of modern information warfare. And of course, we're going to go back in time, because information warfare well predates the things that went on in Ukraine, Estonia, Georgia, and on. But that'll be the module that is the most difficult to put together, because the world's changing under our feet. And you'll probably experience the same thing I experienced when I was getting a master's in warfare. It seemed like the world was a laboratory for us students to watch, because so much was going on. And that'll for sure happen over the next 4 weeks. There'll be contemporaneous happenings in the world of cyber warfare. Module 3, we're going to delve into terrorists and cyber, which for the history of the combination of those two has been kind of asymmetric in the advantage of the defenders. So militaries have used cyber in order to counter terrorism, but obviously the potential is for that to change and flip-flop, because the asymmetries available to cyber attack are powerful and could lead to active terrorist measures. And then in Module 4, we are going to talk about military cyber preparedness. It kind of closes the loop. If there is cyber war, you need cyber weapons to engage in cyber war, and military organizations are going to be key users of those cyber weapons, which is certainly the case so far. If you tuned in to the discussions going on in the forum, one of the questions raised was, what is cyber war? And there are a lot of great discussion there. But I wanted to, give you the direction that I went in coming up with definitions, because I found in this space you have to define what you mean before you can have a logical discussion about it, because otherwise you get caught up in a semantics battle. Oh, it's not warfare, et cetera. And you'll see this anytime you get engaged in this, especially with IT security people. People who've been in this space for 20, 30 years get offended at the military and policymakers co-opting their field. And so we're running into these problems in definitions. But you can go all the way back, as one prominent professor has, who was at King's College. He used the Clausewitzian definition of warfare, which is war is an act of violence to compel our opponents to fulfill our will. And he focused in on violence. So if all of these attacks and all the things I'm going to talk about today don't involve violence, loss of life, loss of property, destruction, if you use a pure Clausewitzian definition, you're going to say, well, that's not warfare. It's something else. Cyber espionage, cyber sabotage, anything but cyber warfare. When I published a book called There Will Be Cyber Warfare, the most common criticism or the title I get is, what are you talking about? There already is. And of course, I believe that's the case. You can go all the way back to the 1996 version of the U.S. Army Field Manual, which defined something called information dominance. So in the 90s and even into the early 2000s, the U.S. military...
So Richard, just to jump in, are you changing slides?
Yeah.
Okay, we're having a bit of trouble. We're still on, those that are viewing the screen, still on the introduction slide.
It says, sharing is pause. Bring your shared window to the front.
Okay, let's... This is the beauty of a live short course, folks.
Uh-huh. We get to jump in.
All right, I might stop.
I can stop and start share for me.
Yeah, maybe stop share and start share again.
Okay. So stop.
There we are, Richard in full size.
Oh yeah, great. And I just gotta figure out what part of this. Oh, here we go.
As Aaron says, it wouldn't be much fun if it worked on the first night.
That's right. Gotta get the right one. Share screen. Okay, what do you see?
All right, so I can see the your presentation software, and it's not in slide mode.
Good. Does it say what is cyber terrorism?
It sure does. Do you want to try and flick through a couple?
Yep, now it works. What is cyber war? All right, cool. So the U.S. Army Field Manual in 1996 talked about something called information dominance, which they equated to the degree of information superiority that allows the possessor to use information systems and capabilities to achieve an operational advantage in a conflict or control the situation. So a very specific concept back then. This is the whole world of network-centric warfare. We're going to control the battle space and the information that flows around through the battle space. As I went through, writing 2 books on cyber warfare, I came up with a definition that's a pretty good working definition, that cyber warfare is the use of network and computer-based attacks to further the political, economic, and military goals of nation states to project force. So in other words, it's an alternative, and it is less committal than full out launching missiles or dropping bombs. So therefore, maybe less expensive, less risky, and if you can accomplish the goals, we're going to talk about a few instances of that without loss of life or risk of loss of life and material of your own, then well worth the investment. Cyber terrorism is a little more difficult, so let's grab a dictionary definition of terrorism: the unlawful use or threatened use of force or violence by a person or an organized group against people or property with the intention of intimidating or coercing societies or governments, often for ideological or political reasons. Keyword here is unlawful. The dictionary had to put that in because this sounds a lot like nation state intimidation, and typically is associated with warfare, which, even though the law of armed conflict isn't a statute, there's, it's governed by norms, not necessarily by treaties or international law. But terrorists would engage in unlawful use of these activities. So adapting that to cyber terrorism, we can use that it's the use of network computer-based attacks with the intention of intimidating or coercing societies or governments, often for ideological or political reasons. The trouble with that definition is it might fall into something we call hacktivism, the things that the anonymous group engages in, and plenty of people before that, right? You take a dislike, maybe there's a group of you take a dislike to somebody else's activities, and you start defacing their web pages and engaging in denial of service attacks. Probably it's the definition is going to have to come down to when terrorist organizations engage in cyber attack. That's cyber terrorism.
So, Richard, I'll just have to interrupt you again. It seems that the slides aren't flicking through. So we're still on what is cyber terrorism.
Okay.
So there's 2 options. We can either try and change the way we're sharing the screen. You might be able to just share the application on your options,
which I've been doing.
Okay, or perhaps just share your full screen, and see if that one changes things. And if that doesn't work, then we'll just watch the slides on your program, and you can just flick through them, and we'll have the sidebar as well.
Okay. So I'm going to share the entire desktop, which will be about the same thing anyways.
Yep.
Good. Desktop 1, it's probably me. Okay, what are you seeing?
So we've got, now it looks like, see if you can flick through some slides.
Okay. You
Yep,
see
that
war and
just went to
weapons.
war and weapons.
Good.
Beauty, wonderful.
Cyber weapons. All right.
Thanks for letting us know, folks.
That's what we'll do next time. So, okay. So if we're going to introduce the topic of cyber warfare, should you talk about cyber weapons first? Turns out in academic circles, this debate is carried on often. Does technology precede changes in the way wars are fought? Or do wars bring on technological changes? And if you want to go down the academic rabbit hole, you can get a PhD discussing the differences between all of these things. And that actually the concept of a revolution in military affairs, where things dramatically change. Often the debate is, well, did the Battle of Crécy, change the way warfare is fought? And long bows were introduced, effectively for the first time, and it changed the way that knights in shining armor could engage in battle, because the longbow shot an arrow that could penetrate that armor, and especially the armor of the horses. Which came first, the longbow or the Battle of Crécy? And obviously, the longbow was probably around for hundreds of years beforehand, with farmers, pilching deer in the elite's fields. So, but I definitely believe following technology is a way to understand changes in the way wars are fought. And of course, the other example, way at the other end of the scale, is the W-88 thermonuclear warhead. Depicted here, artist's concept of what it looks like. The yellow egg-shaped thing is a atom bomb, essentially, that acts as the compressive trigger to a H-bomb in the blue and red circle. The design of this actually has some cyber history to it, because it's attributed to China that they stole the design. Might have been a professor in California, working for one of the weapons labs, who took it. At the time, this was President Clinton's time in the White House, the U.S. kind of just let China have it. And China, up till that time, had massive boosters because their bombs were so big. They could take all those massive boosters and put these smaller, more compact designs that, of course, the U.S. had invested billions in developing, and give them multiple independently targetable reentry vehicles on those missiles. So it's really, really dramatic change in the superpower balance in nuclear forces, thanks to cyber espionage. Good old stuff. So we're going to talk about cyber weapons in 4 categories: malware, computer network attack, implants, and interdiction. And finally, we can't get away without talking about distributed denial of service, because the other ones are very laser focused. Denial of service is kind of the equivalent of a nuclear weapon in the cyber realm. So let's talk about a piece of malware. So this is you'll see it referred to as dark energy by researchers, and it's a derivative of a worm. So meaning that it can spread machine to machine. You can search out vulnerable machines and then infect them. And it's looking for vulnerable systems made by these large SCADA control system companies. So General Electric has a product, Advantech, Web Access, Siemens, which we'll be talking a lot about in a minute. All of these products that give you basically web interface to controlling machinery of some sort. So it could be a power grid. In the case here, I just did a Google image search on GE Simplicity, so you could come up with an image of what we're looking at. If a hacker finds a vulnerable system and cracks into it using this dark energy malware, this is what they're going to see remotely on their computer. And in this case, it's a turbine, which is a great example because turbines spin very rapidly and are easy to disrupt in their operations, overspin them, spin them at their harmonic rates, and they may blow up. And it's a cool little graphic because You can see the two red arrows for up and down. You can manually change the rotating speed of that turbine if you have that remote access. So the reason I think this is an important piece of malware to track is it's in the wild right now. It's all over the place. The United States CERT has warned that it is rampant inside the US's power grid. And it's a direct derivative of sandworm, which has been attributed to Russian intelligence agencies hacking into multiple countries around the world, in particular NATO and security researchers and policymakers around the world. So there's some pretty good attribution that dark energy is associated with these Russian hackers. If you go back and look at the Ukrainian power outage, which occurred 2 years ago now, so 2015, right around Christmas, took down a huge portion of Ukraine's power grid. It was attributed to dark energy. So it's in the world of cyber, policymakers love to talk about so-called cyber Pearl Harbor. What they usually mean by that is an attack on nation-state infrastructure that is devastating, right? They harp all the way back to the massive power outage in 2003 here in the United States, up in the Northeast, which hit where I'm sitting now, here just north of Detroit, and turned off the power for 2 or 3 days. Luckily, it was summer, so we had light during most of the day, and we just had to live without air conditioning. But most of your internet is going to go down after 2 or 3 days, and your batteries on your laptops are going to go down as well, and even your cell phones. So it could be extremely disruptive if something like that happened. There are doomsday scenarios associated with it. I personally think the entire system is more resilient, but we're not taking very many actions in order to defend against this. And Ukraine is the perfect example of why we should be taking actions to defend our infrastructure anywhere in the world, right? Everybody's just as vulnerable.
So, sorry, Richard, just a quick question. Is dark energy the same as black energy? Are those terms interchangeable, or is that a different thing altogether? Might be just an Australian terminology.
Yeah. So dark energy, I don't know. It's like, of course, they're named after the physical sciences of dark matter and dark energy and black matter. So
yeah, just had a few questions. Yeah, interesting. Yeah. Anyone who wants to elaborate can do so in the chat. Sorry to interrupt.
No worries. So I'm going to dive into the 2011 attacks on RSA. So RSA is the security division of EMC. It was back then. And they had a very large team, about 23 people, just devoted to protecting RSA from network-based attacks. And yet they succumbed to a very, very sophisticated attack. The delivery model, as in many of these so-called APT-style attacks, advanced persistent threat, started with an elaborate phishing scheme where the attackers became aware of an email interchange between employees of RSA and an outside benefits company, and they were passing back and forth a spreadsheet that had, benefit proposals or something. And the attackers interjected themselves in that email exchange, modified the spreadsheet to include a dropper for malware. This is called weaponization. And then responded to everybody who was on the list and said, here's an updated version of the benefits package. And several people inside RSA opened it and got infected with a worm that started to spread. And it used multiple methods to get privilege escalation and then finally work its way through the system. The security team at RSA had been monitoring everything, but has only had just a couple indicators of compromise clued them into the fact that something might be going on. Between the time they noticed They had network traffic, and they had an artifact on a machine. Between the time they noticed and the time that the exfiltration of some very interesting data was only about 3 days. But they had some response time. And I've even talked to the engineer who was there doing the investigation, saw the attackers exfiltrating a file. I don't know if it's a database or a spreadsheet or a text file that had all of the super secret seeds to these Secure ID tokens. So RSA Secure ID is probably the most commonly used one-time password token in the world. I've seen them handed out at Commonwealth Bank, for instance, in Australia. And the very, very well researched by attackers. And it had been determined the only way to crack a RSA Secure ID token was to have physical access to it and put it in a microwave, somehow subject it to stress, and trick it into squirting out what that secret seed is that tells it what random number to show every 60 seconds or 2 minutes. So RSA recognizes that they've lost most of this file, and they publish a notice, which is still available on the Security Exchange Commission's website. And the communicator, who was the lawyer for RSA, said, "At this time, we are confident that the information extracted does not enable a successful direct attack on any of our RSA Secure ID customers." And they had to communicate one-on-one with all 30,000 of their customers, which they did. It's probably, the real story was their incident response plan, how quickly they brought it together, and how quickly they notified their customers of this issue. But they're still saying, probably not a problem. In other words, don't worry about it. Well, that's all well and good. So that was May. That was March. By May, Lockheed Martin saw an attack against their network from somebody who had logged in with their RSA Secure ID token. They immediately correlated some other artifacts of the attack: IP address, time of day, methodology, machines they were interested in, with a campaign they had been tracking for over a year. Lockheed Martin was able to recognize the attack as it was going on that had used the stolen secret seeds to RSA Secure ID tokens, and were able to hit a big red button and shut off remote access for all 80,000 employees at Lockheed Martin. I went to talk to them because I hadn't been exposed to anybody who could counter such a sophisticated attack. Keep in mind that Lockheed Martin's part of the U.S. Defense Industrial Base. They'd already been through, starting in 2003, multiple sophisticated attacks, most of them attributed to China. So they built up a response to this over time, and they codified it in something called the cyber kill chain. So it's in one of the suggested readings in the course. But this white paper is foundational. They decided that there were all these phases of an attack, and during each phase, you had opportunities to detect, deny, disrupt, degrade, deceive, or destroy. And they started lining up the technologies that were available in order to accomplish all of those for these different stages of the cyber kill chain. The first phase is reconnaissance, very difficult to discover because somebody could just be doing Google searches, trying to enumerate how many locations you had, the names of your executives, the names of your technology people, the people who are attending conferences, speaking at conferences, and that's one of the most difficult to detect when that's going on, other than if you're tapping into the back channel discussions that hackers tend to have, and that's where the whole threat intelligence space comes in. The next phase is the weaponization, where they decide, hey, we are going to send out a PDF of the conference schedule to all the attendees and try and get them to open it up and get infected. That's the delivery model. And then, of course, the exploitation uses the vulnerability in the target system. Install, usually just a dropper, but ultimately a Trojan horse that can be updated and usually communicates back to the command and control server, where they get to control what happens from there. And then finally, the what they call actions on objectives, probably is stealing data, some sort of information that they were after. So you'll hear in all the world of cyber warfare and cyber defense, you'll hear people refer back to this framework for these types of targeted attacks. Good place to pause if there are any questions. Do you want to throw at me, Guy?
Yeah, there's plenty. I'll start with just a general discussion point. Is this course, is it coming from a very particular perspective on what is cyber terrorism, what is hacktivism, what is cyber warfare, or is it just sort of like, well, it's a really contentious issue and it's quite argued, because there's a lot of questions about, well, what are the distinctions?
Yeah, so I think the course comes from my perspective, which I tend to line up with a so-called realist perspective, which is one of the ways of approaching history in general. And, so therefore, certainly I take the perspective that cyber warfare is the future of warfare, that all future battles between technologically advanced powers will involve cyber warfare. There will be, one country won't invade another country without first softening up the territory by, before they start launching missiles and carpet bombing, they're going to try and shut off power grid and emergency communications, all communications, in order to make the target softer and easier to penetrate. So I guess that's the perspective.
Okay, so I might leave the distinctions, but it does, or the questions on distinctions. But there's an interesting question from Mario, if that's the case, who asks whether a war by definition contains a declaration of war.
Yeah, that hasn't happened in for major powers in my lifetime. So yeah, we don't think there'll be declarations of war, and because we live in a nuclear era. And all war, could escalate to all-out war quickly. So nobody can say, I declare war on you, other nuclear power, because that would mean hit the button and wipe each other out as quickly as possible. So we've entered a new world where wars are fought on a lower level plane. They do turn into shooting wars. Obviously, we've got several hotspots around the world, even as we speak. But those also engaged in cyber effects right now. So certainly espionage. You still have to know what the adversary's intent and capability is, and that's the war on terrorism involves a lot of cyber espionage and signals intelligence to do that. But if there's a battle, for instance, the theme behind my book is that the next engagement between, say, China and the United States, I said it in the Taiwan Straits, but obviously it could occur in the South China Sea. An engagement like that will probably incorporate, exploitation of vulnerabilities in airplanes, command and controls, precision weapon systems, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance systems, right? You want to recreate the fog of war that all those things were intended to eliminate in the first place.
Great. We've got a question on from F05505. Have there been any changes or protections put in place for the RSA tokens since they were compromised?
So they've replaced the secret seeds, right? So they're perfectly good to use today. Somebody would have to re-steal the secret seeds. So the algorithm was good. It's just like encryption. It's as if somebody had stolen somebody's encryption key. The solution is replace all the keys, and that's what they've done. So.
Okay, a question from Sam. Where do you see cyber criminal back channel communications going in the future? For example, IRC to ICQ to encrypted Jabber.
Yeah. So, cyber criminals have to work in a marketplace. So for the most part, they still have to communicate. And I'm sure today it's various versions of WhatsApp and Signal. So they're trying to use really good encrypted channels, but they still have to come to a forum. So then they have to establish trust with the other forum members. They're using Tor to hide the location of their so-called deep dark web discussion boards and marketplaces. But unfortunately, they're continuously infiltrated by both law enforcement and the companies that are researching the deep dark web communications. So to me, that's just going to be a continuous escalation. But the real issue for cyber criminals is how do they establish trust with the people they're doing business with, same as any criminal organization. So I don't know where it's going to go, but certainly know that they've got a real problem because I suspect the number of law enforcement bumping into each other on these forums is getting higher and higher.
There's so many good questions, Richard. I'll just choose one more, and I invite everyone to, number one, put the questions in the chat for just general attendees to have a think about. But also, I really recommend posting in the forums these interesting questions. You'd be amazed some of the great threads that are already there and that will come out of these lectures. I'll just ask Daryl's second question, actually. Where do you think cyber warfare should sit between the political and all-out war continuum? He sort of notes that it might be, or wonders whether it's conceivable that a well-targeted cyber warfare attack could be more devastating than nuclear in terms of disabling a society.
Yeah. So let me lead into that by talking about Stuxnet. Because Stuxnet is an example of using a cyber operation, cyber attack, in order to achieve the goals of a nation state. So there's no question that most of the West, and a good part of the Mideast, would prefer that Iran not have nuclear weapons. Iran has been engaged in a decades-long effort in order to build their own nuclear capability, which involves refining uranium ore into weapons-grade uranium. So they could get, if they had enough, they could get their first atom bomb. And the alternative to, other than sanctions and political pressure, is to, bomb their facilities, engage in a war with them, or as George Bush Jr. and later President Obama decided, is to engage in a cyber operation called Olympic Games, and to great effect. So in the future, we'll talk throughout this course on the possibility of a major cyber attack that debilitates a country, changes the course of or the balance of power between nations. But for now, a very, very targeted, super sophisticated, eye-opening attack on Iran's ability to refine uranium ore. Stuxnet, when it was discovered, was immediately analyzed by a bunch of the security research companies, antivirus companies, Symantec in particular. It used 4 0 days. So 0 day, of course, is a vulnerability and typically comes with an exploit against that vulnerability that's never been discovered before. So these are extremely valuable piece of information to have to know that a system is vulnerable. In particular, Microsoft Windows had this shortcut link vulnerability that allowed automatic file execution. So if you plugged a USB device that had the exploit code in it into a machine, just viewing what was on the USB device would infect the machine. So, of course, USB devices, thumb drives, etc., are fabulous ways to penetrate a network that's completely air-gapped from the rest of the world. And the nuclear refinement facilities in Iran were definitely air-gapped, right? They're underground. They didn't want any network attention because obviously the intelligence agencies around the world would be hammering on the door. So somehow they managed to get a USB device through that air gap into the facility. Somebody plugged it in. It could be an insider, could be somebody who had plugged it into their machine at home and gotten infected and then carried it into work. And once it got in, it started to spread like a worm. And it was looking for machines that, desktop machines, Windows PCs that were running a piece of software from Siemens called Step 7. So very similar to the one that I showed in the earlier example with dark energy. Used other zero-day vulnerabilities in print spooler, and then 2 new 0 days that gave them privilege escalation to get the control of the machines that it infected. And on top of that, it used some unpatched vulnerabilities. So they weren't 0 days, but they're things that have been around for a couple of years. You can tell by the CVE number that this Microsoft Windows server for RPC handling was discovered in 2008. But of course, not everybody patches as they're supposed to. So now we have super sophisticated malware installed surreptitiously on a network, spreads throughout the network, and did this very, very specific thing. It found the Step 7 software running on a desktop. It replaced the existing DLL for controlling, sending signals to a programmable logic controller on the plant floor. Replaced it with something that would just look at all the requests for, we're going to send a data block to this PLC on the plant floor. Look for ones that were specific to a particular type of PLC that was controlling a very specific type of step motor. When it saw that, it changed the data that was sent to the step motor. So in other words, if it was not on a system that had the type of step motor that was controlling the centrifuges for uranium ore refinement, it's actually a gas centrifuge, then it wouldn't do anything. But if it was that particular device connected to that particular PLC, it would send the wrong commands and cause it to spin at the wrong rate. So it could have overspun it, could have picked just the frequency that the thing would fall apart. And according to David Sanger at the New York Times, the United States developed that internally, tested it on examples of those centrifuges that they had, and they literally tore them apart. So interesting side note, that image of the PLC is sitting in a red team environment in a training facility in Israel. So I had to get my own picture of the Siemens PLC. So over 1,000, I've seen numbers up to 2,200 of these centrifuges, these tall aluminum columns here, were destroyed. So you see the president of Iran walking down these columns, but you realize inside those is extremely poisonous radioactive gas, not in huge quantities, but enough to definitely make you worry. Imagine one of those falling apart and breaking open. So that entire facility would be contaminated. So everybody in there would be wearing hazmat suits, and that's what happened over a period of months in the Natanz. So, lesson learned, very effective. Probably the cost was a lot less, certainly a lot less in lost lives of the attackers, the U.S. in this case, and plausible deniability. At the time, nobody could point the finger at the United States. Took a little while for the attribution to come out in this case. So we're still talking cyber weapons, and I got to kind of rush into some of the cool stuff that occurred in 2003. And I want to talk about the tailored access operations of the NSA. So a group that is specifically assigned the task of, hey, we're having trouble getting into a particular facility. There's some information we want. We need you to devise a way to break in. And the Tailored Access Operations Group is credited with a lot of the Stuxnet development, though delivery and other parts of the development may have been done by Israel. But Der Spiegel published the entire ANT catalog of the tailored access operations. Basically, it's a secret unit, produces special equipment ranging from spyware for computers and cell phones to listening posts and USB sticks for bugging devices. Some of I've got it in the recommended reading. The Electronic Frontier Foundation still maintains the entire catalog that we saw at the time. But when you first see these pages, you realize, wow, this really is a catalog. This is something developed by a group inside the NSA that have been published internally that allow people to go, hey, I need this particular capability. Deity Bounce provides software application persistence on Dell PowerEdge servers, for instance. And you just page through, dozens of pages of these things that were available. Sometimes they have prices associated with them. They've usually got the technical specs, which BIOS versions, which models this will work against. And presumably, if you got a model that's not in the catalog, you get on the phone and ask them to customize something for you. Between the ANT catalog from the Tailored Access operations and Edward Snowden's revelations all in that same year, we've collected the names of all of these cyber weapons. And there's very little other terminology you can use for them. They've got, very militaristic, maybe random name generation for them. Some of them the names seem to actually correlate with what they do. I've highlighted two of them here, which you probably heard about. Fox Acid, combined with Quantum, Fox Acid gives the attacker the ability to basically take advantage of the latency in the internet. So if they have a server sitting on the internet between, say, somebody who's going to let's say a jihadi recruiting site, they can host their server closer to them in terms of internet speed. So instead of 190 milliseconds, just 80 milliseconds away, recognize when they're connecting to a particular site and serve them up, a different ad with malware than they would get from the site they're going to. So even if you're going to CNN.com, they don't have to crack into CNN in order to deliver malware to you over the internet. There's one component of this that would actually capture crash reports from Windows servers because they could get in the stream on the internet and see that earlier than anybody else. So we've got collection capabilities, we've got separate databases. These are the things you read about being stored in the big, huge NSA data centers. And then you've got the data processing, which are, you think of them as the Googles for an intelligence service. So X-Keyscore is the one that gets a lot of attention. Put in somebody's email address, name, IP address, and it gives you all of the information that they have on that particular target, which has created I think this shook a lot of intelligence agencies to their foundation, let alone the privacy professionals of the world. No idea that the US had invested so heavily in all of this. And don't forget, this is 2003, just a point in time. That was or 2013, so that was 4 years ago. A lot has happened since then. So another one to think about is JetPlow, which is a particular ANT product that can be inserted into a Cisco PIX device. So Cisco PIX is probably still one of the most dominant firewalls deployed out there. So here's a tool if you're an intelligence agency that wants to intercept traffic, for instance, from a gateway device. And probably the most controversial thing that came out of of many of the Snowden revelations was these images of an interdiction site somewhere, probably in Texas or New Mexico, where they would intercept a package being delivered from Cisco. You can zoom in on that box on the left. That's a Cisco box. And they take apart the package, open up the Cisco router or firewall, and insert either chips or software in the BIOS in order to ensure when it's delivered that it's already compromised in some way. So last topic is DDoS, because we have to cover it because it is such a damaging method or cyber weapon. Distributed denial of service attack. So it's disabling or destroying an online resource through overwhelming it via too many requests. And this can take many forms. So the original forms were a ping flood. So ping is just a protocol. It takes advantage of the UDP protocol. You just check to see if the machine's there. But if you send enough pings to any machine on the internet, it can't receive any other traffic. So you pretty much have flooded the pipe to the device. Get floods are basically, I'm going to get a web page over and over and over, and the server is just going to fall over and die. It can't serve up the same web page a million times, especially if it's a complicated web page that maybe takes some back-end processing, like a graph, to generate every time. And SYN floods are just another more sophisticated kind of way to bog down a server. It's resource depletion. So a resource I suggest you read is Fatal System Error by Joseph Min. So he gives the story of Barrett Lyon, who was the founder of a company called Prolexic, and he created Prolexic to counter denial of service attacks that were part of this extortion ring. So a bunch of young hackers in Russia had decided that they were going to attack online gaming sites, mostly in Costa Rica, and basically say, hey, pay us $30,000 or your gaming site's going down. And of course, they'd lose $30,000 a day if their gaming, their online gambling site was down. So they were actually paying this. So they came to Barrett and said, build us a service, which he did. And that company went on to be very successful at these types of defenses and was acquired by Akamai a couple of years ago. So Akamai, the big content delivery network. So denial of service could be as simple as a resource depletion bug in the way a web server is implemented. This is what the Jester uses. So real quickly, the Jester is a vigilante who actually goes after jihadists. And in the first couple of years of his operations, he was taking out jihadi websites with his simple little tool. So that's, pretty easy to defend against. Just patch your web server, you're good to go. But in 2009, we saw denial of service attacks that were crowdsourced. So this was an uprising that was going on. So we had the vote going on in Iran, and there's a lot of questions about the validity of the vote for president. So there was an online kind of revolution that started, and people were tweeting things like the message on your screen. The Khomeini's website and the president's website are down. Keep it up. If you can't use the LOAC tool, just use pagereload.com. So I've got an image of LOAC, Low Orbit Ion Cannon. This is a free tool. You can download it. Anybody you're upset with, if you're on an online gaming network, Sony PlayStation or something, if you can get the IP address of your opponent, you can just hammer them with various packets, and that'll slow down his or her response time and give you an advantage in the game. So people are using this free tool in order to engage in attacks during the Iranian elections and the protests that followed immediately afterwards. But what's this page reload? So this is poor man's DDoS. You go to page reload and it will just continuously refresh your browser for you on a page. So it's just like hitting refresh on a page. And somebody created this wonderful set of iframes that reloaded multiple pages at once. So they started tweeting out the URL to go to. And I have to admit, in order to get this screenshot, I had to engage in DDoS attacks against the president of Iran's website, only for the couple seconds it took to get the screenshot. It's not my battle. But if denial of service attack via crowdsourcing is good, why not use a botnet? Why not enroll hundreds of thousands of machines unknowingly to the owners of them by infecting them with malware? So a worm that spreads rapidly, which is exactly what happened in the summer of 2009, attributed to DPRK, so North Korea, basically enrolled in a period of 2 weeks over 200,000 machines, and then turned their sights on all these websites. So you had DHS.gov, the FAA in the United States, the FTC, Voice of America, or US Postal Service, US Bank, and a whole bunch of South Korean websites as well, and basically was taking them all offline. it was quite an interesting time. Practically all the U.S. government sites moved to Akamai after that, so they'd have this capability in defense, and it really gave rise to the DDoS defense business. So, phew, I was moving faster at the end here to get through all the slides. Next week, we are going to address the fact that it turns out, even after all I've said, that the West are amateurs. Russia knows information war. We're going to delve into that. And there'll probably be 6 things that happen between now and then that hopefully I'll be able to report on. Questions, Guy?
Of course, there's always many questions, and they're quite good again. There's a couple of questions on Kaspersky. I'll ask Heidi, where do we draw the line? When does an action become cyber war? And when does a government admit to conducting cyber war and stop using the justification of it's for the greater good? Recent actions with Kaspersky, is his counter to NSA compromising Cisco devices? Is it?
Yeah, you know that Kaspersky is one of the best research groups for finding NSA malware. So they found Dooku, they found Flame, before we knew what their purpose was, or they had a code name associated with them. I'm still, because I come from the security industry, I agree with Eugene Kaspersky's claims that, how could he do that? That would destroy his company. Obviously, for nation and political purposes, one would put your whole company at risk if he felt it was necessary. But I think it's an example of an unfortunate digital mercantilism that we're experiencing. Even way back when Checkpoint, which had arguably the best firewall software at the time, was trying to get into the US, a lot of military types were talking about, oh, you can't use them, they're Israeli. And more recently, Huawei has had to just almost pull out of the United States, can't be successful here because of this fear-mongering that Huawei, must be the People's Liberation Army, working to get in. Interesting to note that the only exploit and vulnerabilities in Huawei gear that have ever been publicized were ones that were implanted by the NSA. So I think you can't trust any vendor, and therefore you have to build in multiple defenses to, let the vendors watch each other.
And there's a couple of questions here about Kaspersky being used by the Russians, or perhaps Norton being used by the Americans. To what extent do you think that the corporations and state actors are sort of interacting? What is their relationship?
Yeah, in my naive pre-Snowden way, I would have said, oh, it can't happen. But we saw with Prism that most of the major internet companies in the US had arrangements with the NSA to feed them data. So it included Yahoo and Apple and Google, and goes on and on. So I think that risk is always there. I'd like to see them standing up and pushing back. Still waiting for Juniper, Cisco, Fortinet to discover some of these implants in their machines and publish fixes for the exploits that they're using. It hasn't happened in all that time.
Okay, of course there's far too many questions to answer, but I might just ask one last one as a nice sort of closer before we bring Jason in. From Bridget, in summary, having discussed all of these tools, what can we say is the major aim or rationale of cyber warfare? Would you sort of take the realist approach and say, well, it's a zero-sum game, and it's about who has power and how much power?
Yeah, I would, because I don't think there's any long-term advantage to getting there. It's going to be an arms race. And right now, the debilitating attack against a country's infrastructure would be pointless unless you actually intend to invade them. So I'm sure there are hotspots around the world where that could still happen. Obviously, it did happen in Georgia and Ukraine. But the thought of, Russia versus U.S., China versus the U.S. For that level of attack is, I think, still way in the future. It'll only be a last recourse, along with everything else that comes with all-out war.
Beauty. Well, thanks very much, Richard. We'll chuck to the next slide. We've got that forum discussion point. So what you can do, folks, is I've preloaded these sort of discussion points onto the forum, and you can have a good chat about those. But really, there's so many great questions flooding in that if you want to have open a new thread, start a new thread in those weekly discussion forums, I really think it could be quite interesting.
And I'll jump in as much as I can. This is really great, the forums.
Yeah, really exciting. So for now, I think I'll welcome Jason. Are you about, Jason?
I am indeed. Thank you, Guy.
Beauty. I'll make you co-host and you can share your screen, and Richard will bring you back in just a moment.
Yep.
Okay.
Great. So I can actually share now, Guy, so if I can do that.
Go for it.
Yep. Great, thank you and welcome everyone. Hopefully you can see my slide there on the screen. My name is Jason Howarth. I'm the Associate Head of School Computing and Maths with Charles Sturt University. I want to take a slightly different tack, take about 10 minutes of your time to talk about a little research project that I'm doing that I really would like you guys to get involved with. And it is pertinent. It's what I call the MOOC to University pathway. And what I'm studying is the impact of short courses like the one Richard is presenting now on your perceptions of whether you want to go to university, and also your perceptions about, the university associated with the short course, which in this case is Charles Sturt or CSU. So I want to tell you briefly about that. And then that sort of segues into some, I guess, unashamed marketing about some reasons why I think you should consider university and Charles Sturt. Next week, at the end of Richard's presentation, again, I'd like to do a bit of a deep dive on one of our courses in particular, the Master of Cybersecurity, and have a look at what's involved in that particular course, including looking at the assessments, how it's delivered, and so on. So today's a bit of a sort of a top-level overview of my research and some of the benefits to you guys of studying or choosing to go from, say, a free short course to a master's. So to give you a little bit of background about Charles Sturt, we've been working closely with IT Masters now for around about 13 or 14 years. Time gets away. And CSU itself is an accredited Australian university that has a host of campuses, particularly in regional Australia, places like Bathurst, Wagga, Albury, but we also have partner operations in Melbourne and Sydney. I think the predominant feature about Charles Sturt is we're very much an online university. So of our 40,000 or so students, around about 24,000 of those are based online and studying wholly online. So it is one of the largest online institutions within Australia, and that's in many ways our main focus. So I mentioned before the CSU IT Masters relationship. It's been going for 13 or so years now, and we have a whole suite of very much IT-focused courses. You can see them on the screen there. We've divided them up into what we call graduate certificates, which are smaller subsets, if you like, of associated masters. They consist of 4 subjects, and we have master's courses that are 12 subjects long. And you can see the content that we're covering there. It covers the spectrum of sort of cloud computing, cybersecurity, IT management, developing mobile apps, and so on. So a really big host of courses. I won't go into depth about any of these today. I will point out, though, that many students who enter our programs come in through the short graduate certificate courses, which are 4 subjects, and then they can move across to the masters. And typically, they would take those 4 subjects with them as credit. So as an example, if you did the grad cert in cybersecurity, did the 4 subjects, moved across to the Master of Cybersecurity, you would take your 4 subjects as credit, leaving only 8 subjects to complete the Masters. So effectively, 12 subjects get you 2 degrees, the grad cert and the master's. So that's the overall big picture of the kinds of courses and postgraduate courses that we're offering here at CSU. Now, where my research comes into it to start with, let's take one particular course, one that's launching next year, which is obviously potentially interesting to you guys, the Master of Cybersecurity. So it's a 12-subject, fully online master's, kicks off in 2018. And you can see the subjects there. We've divided them into core subjects, which every student must do, and into elective subjects where you get a choice of units to suit your taste. Now, lots of interesting units there. You're looking at stuff like dark web, digital forensics, hacking countermeasures, professional system security, which is based on the CISSP certification content. But what I want to draw your attention to is the unit there, cyber warfare and terrorism, which is the full unit of what you're studying now. So Richard is presenting here 4 weeks of a subject that will be run in its entirety next year over 12 weeks in the actual masters. So what these short courses function as I think Guy alluded to at the start, is a kind of taster to what it's like to study this material at CSU. It's obviously a compressed version, but it very much gives you the sense of the kinds of topics that we cover and the kind of delivery mechanisms that we use. We'll talk more about the Master of Cybersecurity next week when I dive into some of the units in more depth. But in terms of the project that I'm conducting, and which I'd like you to get involved with, it's really about, does doing a free course, or sometimes the nomenclature is MOOC, massive open online course, does doing one of these free short courses influence your later intention to enroll at CSU or at university in general? So what I'm asking people to do is to complete 2 brief online surveys, one at the start of this particular short course, asking things such as your goals, why you're doing the course, what's your opinion of studying at university, what's your intention with respect to studying at Charles Sturt. Complete that survey at the start of the short course, and then I'll email you a link at the end of the short course, and I kind of want to get your impressions afterwards and see what's changed. Has the short course influenced your attitude towards CSU, towards studying at university in general, and so on? And that's really valuable information, I think, for not just us, but for all universities. So for those who want to get involved, there's a link on the discussion forum for the cyber warfare course. It's called a research participation request. If you can go into that forum posting, you'll find the link, and please, I invite you to complete the first survey and get things started. Then I'll be in touch at the end of the course and ask you to complete the follow-on survey. As a benefit of doing that, I'll also provide you with a summary of the results of the findings. So that could be useful for you guys as well. Okay, so that's the research aspect. What I want to move to now is a quick overview of what are some of the reasons that I see are beneficial for you moving from a free short course like this one to postgraduate study with CSU into one of our IT Masters courses. I just want to focus on some of the key selling points. So because not everyone is aware of the qualification hierarchy, when we're talking about a master's, you know, it's pretty much at the top of the hierarchy or the qualification tree in universities. So universities have their undergraduate degrees, which are bachelor's. They then move up to their graduate certificates, which are typically 4 subject courses. That's higher than a bachelor's level in terms of its Australian qualifications framework level. Then you move to a master's, and then right up the top you have your doctorate, which, you know, typically you're doing a thesis. At the end you get to be called a doctor. For most practical purposes, for people in industry, a master's is probably as far as you want to go, unless you're looking out for a research position. So what we're talking about in the suite of courses we're offering here are master's degrees, and they're coursework masters. So there's no thesis necessarily attached to them. There are project subjects, but they consist of coursework subjects. So that's some terminology out of the way. In terms of why you would want to get a master's or a higher degree, these figures are from the Australian Bureau of Statistics, median starting salaries or median salaries by degree based on ABS data, and they report a midpoint of salaries based on self-identification, I guess, of people and their qualifications. And you can see as you move up from bachelor's to graduate certificate through to master's and doctorate, the median salary obviously increases. Over a lifetime, that can make an enormous difference. So that's obviously a selling point, is the greater capacity to earn a higher salary, to gain promotion and so on. The flip side of that, again from the ABS data, the Australian Bureau of Statistics, the higher you go with your degree, the more the unemployment rate trend line goes downwards. So you can see here again from the ABS 2015, on the right-hand side, having no qualification, the unemployment rate for this particular segment was 8.7. As you move through your Cert 3s and 4s from TAFE and diplomas, up to your graduate degrees, which does include both bachelor and masters, the unemployment rate goes down. So another key selling point. In terms of why CSU, why you would be looking at studying at CSU, there's a few selling points I want to mention. One is we're a market leader in online education. I mentioned that at the outset. We have around 24,000 students enrolled online within all of our programs, which makes us up and in fact the leader within Australia on those figures. And what that means as well is that you as a working person, as a professional person, can engage completely online, remote from the university, using the kinds of technologies that you're experiencing here within this free short course. Webinars, forum postings, Moodles. We're also a market leader in the IT postgraduate space within Australia. And that's a snapshot, again, from one particular year, the enrolments of various universities within the IT postgraduate space across Australia, and CSU is well out in front once again in that area. And it's an area that we constantly dominate in terms of not just enrolment figures, but also statistics such as graduate starting salaries and employment rates, where in terms of graduates getting employment, we're actually the highest in the country. Okay, so in terms of entry requirements, some of the other benefits that I see, and something that's often overlooked by people who might be considering university, is that obviously you can get into a master's if you're bachelor qualified. For most masters, it depends obviously sometimes on experience, but a bachelor's degree or higher is going to get you into a lot of masters within Australia. One thing we allow at Charles Sturt, particularly in the IT Masters suite of courses, is for you to enter into the Masters based on your industry experience, even if you don't have a bachelor's degree. And, we're not looking, we are looking at some reasonably serious experience, a limited of 3+ years in a senior role, but there is a pathway for you. So for those of you thinking, look, I got straight into the industry, I didn't get my bachelor's, it takes 6 years part-time to get a bachelor's. Conversely, master's is 2 years part-time. Please come and talk to us, because there may be a pathway for you into a master's based on that experience. You can also, if you want, if you're curious about that, whether you're eligible based on your qualifications, you can actually go to the IT Masters website and fill out what we call an eligibility form, which talks about whether you're eligible or not. You can even apply directly to CSU, and eligibility is assessed as part of that application process. But certainly the entry requirements that we have here at Charles Sturt are flexible. Another thing that's flexible is our time commitment. As from next year, we'll be starting with 6 sessions per year for courses in our IT Masters program. That means you can kick off your study in January, very early January, 8th of January, I think it starts, for those wanting to get started sort of over that Christmas break. We have an intake in February, May, July, August, and November. So very flexible in terms of starting options. In terms of time commitment, you work on the fact that every unit that you study at Charles Sturt equates to around about 10 hours of study per week. You can also cut back on study loads, etc. So there is a great deal of flexibility there as well. As I mentioned, it's all online, so there's no need ever to set foot on the campus. It can all be transacted electronically. Just quickly looking at some of the big picture issues, cost is obviously an important one. When you're looking at how much a degree is going to cost you, for the IT Masters courses, $3,150 per subject for Australian and New Zealand students starting in 2018. For international students, that's slightly higher, $3,350 per subject in 2018. So the bracketed figures are the 2018 numbers: $3,250 in 2018 for Aussie and New Zealand students, $3,350 for international students. 2017, you would really have to hurry if you want to start now, because the session has actually officially started. It still may be possible though, if you're super keen to start in 2017 and to lock in a slightly lower fee. Textbook costs are included within those fees. You should also be mindful that it's worth talking to your accountant whether you can claim any of your educational fees back as a business expense, given that, you know, for many of you it will be related to your workplace. It seems odd perhaps to talk about cost as a benefit of university, but remember the median salaries we spoke of before. I love the article in the Sydney Morning Herald, which was published recently. You can Google that. A university degree is worth around about 1.2 million over the course of a lifetime. So that's a university degree versus no university degree based on median salaries for those with and those without. But you can also work out that, you know, on the median salaries I reported before, masters versus bachelors, around about a 20 to 25 median salary difference over the course of a lifetime. That means a lot of money. So yeah, cost obviously is not in itself a selling factor, but when you look at cost benefit, then it very much comes into play. So look, that's the broad overview I wanted to give of some of the reasons why you might consider CSU, you might consider university as a follow-on option from this free short course. What I want to focus on next week, and which I've put up on screen there, is our Master of Cybersecurity course, which kicks off in 2018. Very excited about that. You can see that there's a lot of great units there, everything from dark web to forensics, where you're conducting an actual digital forensics investigation as part of the assessment, hacking countermeasures, professional security. On the right-hand side are electives in areas as broad as cryptography, forensic investigation, and incident response. So a really topical masters that's light on sort of the fluffy stuff, such as I guess essay writing and communication, heavy on the technical content. That's how we designed it. So let me tell you more about that particular course next week. We'll do a deep dive, look at some particular subjects, and look at what's involved in studying that. In the interim, if you do have any questions about what I've presented today, please don't hesitate to get in touch. Love to hear from potential students. You can email me, jhoward@csu.edu.au, or my friend from IT Masters, great guy, Neil McCosh, neil.mccosh@itmasters.edu.au. And let's talk next week a little bit closer about the Master of Cyber Security course. So back to you, Guy. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Jason. Just a quick question before you go. Shay's asked with regard to your survey that she imagines you don't want people who are already doing a grad cert at CSU to do the survey.
Look, it's fine. I do have a question there around your current educational status. So okay, that will be something that we control for. So if you're doing something already, that's absolutely fine. You can still complete the survey. That will still give us some valuable data. So please, that would be great.
And then next week, will you chat about maybe differences in different masters? There's been a couple of questions about that.
We'll go into a deep dive into some of the masters, what we're doing,
okay,
and the overall description about each of the masters and where they lead, yes.
Great. All right, well, Jason will be back next week and we'll answer those questions then. I might say thank you very much, Jason, and invite Richard back to see us out for the night.
All right.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you, Jason. And thank you to everyone for sticking around. Yeah. Richard, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I guess, there's a bunch of assigned reading. If you delve into that, hopefully you can get to my book. It's at a site called book.io. I think we've given you the link for that. If you have trouble getting it, somebody reach out to me. I've set the price to $0, so you don't have to buy the book.
Yeah, and those resources are on the last slide of the slide deck, and they're available on the course page, the learn.itmasters.edu.au. And also, we had a question throughout the webinar tonight, Richard, today, Richard, wherever you are, about sort of must-read books. People were talking about your book and other books that you referenced. I can't remember what it was off the top of my head, but they're wondering if you could perhaps provide a list of good books.
All of these behind me.
There you go. Take a screenshot, folks.
Yep.
We'll get a forum discussion going.
Yeah, I'll provide that. There are some really good ones.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, Richard. Thank you, Jason. Thank you, everyone, for hanging around.
Thanks, Guy. Thanks, Jason.
Good on you. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.